The world is a fury of white. Snow, driven by a wind with teeth, erases the line between earth and sky, turning the vast Wyoming territory into a single, churning vortex of cold. Alara stumbles through it, a ghost in a threadbare coat, clutching a small, pathetic bundle that holds the entirety of her worldly possessions. Each step is a gamble, her boots sinking into drifts that steal the last of her warmth. Ahead, a pinprick of orange light wavers in the blizzard, a promise too faint to be real. A lamp in a window, a house, a chance. She fights toward it, her breath frosting in ragged plumes, until the last of her strength gives out, and she collapses into the snow at the edge of a porch, the light of the lamp the last thing she sees before the world goes black. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The man who finds her is built of the same hard lines as the land itself. Silas moves with a quiet economy, his shadow long and imposing in the doorway as he looks down at the heap of snow and wool that is Alara. He doesn't hesitate. With a grunt, he scoops her up. She weighs next to nothing, and carries her inside, kicking the door shut against the howling wind. He deposits her on the rug before the cold hearth, her body limp and unresponsive. The cabin is Spartan, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and solitude. For a long while, the only sounds are the roar of the blizzard outside and the methodical crackle and pop as Silas builds a fire, his movements sure and practiced. He works without fuss, bringing a blaze to life that begins to push back the bone-deep chill. She stirs as the warmth seeps into her, a low moan escaping her chapped lips. Her eyes flutter open, seeing only the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling and the dancing firelight. Her first coherent thought is of being a burden. Her voice is a raw, broken whisper. The barn. I can sleep in the barn. Silas turns from the hearth, his face a mask of shadow and light, his expression unreadable. He looks at the shivering, half-frozen woman on his floor, a piece of driftwood washed up by the storm, and his voice is low and rough as gravel. You'll bed beside me or nowhere. His words hung in the air, as sharp and cold as the wind outside. Alara flinched, a fresh wave of fear cutting through the fog of her exhaustion. She tried to push herself up, to shrink away, but her limbs were heavy, useless things. This was it then. She had traded a slow death in the snow for a swifter, uglier fate. The stories she'd heard about solitary men in the wilderness, men starved for company of any kind, flooded her mind. But the man, Silas, did not move toward her. He simply watched her for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to take in her tattered dress, her chapped hands, the terror blooming on her face. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole winter, he gestured with his chin toward a simple cot in the far corner of the single room. You take the cot, he clarified, his tone clipped, impatient. He then pointed to a thick bedroll of furs and blankets laid out on the floorboards much closer to the hearth. That's my place. Beside me. Beside the fire. I'll not have a soul freezing to death in my barn like a stray calf. The relief that washed over Alara was so profound it left her dizzy. She misunderstood. He wasn't a predator. He was just direct. And odd. His brand of charity was gruff, couched in pragmatism, stripped of any comforting softness. He saw a person freezing, and his solution was to put them near the fire. That the fire happened to be where he also slept was an incidental fact. He disappeared for a moment behind a partition and returned with a dry, rough-spun shirt and a heavy wool blanket. He dropped them beside her without a word and turned his back, affording her a privacy that was more respectful than any pretty words could have been. She fumbled with her frozen fingers to shed her wet outer layers, her body shaking uncontrollably. The cabin was a fortress of solitude. A rifle rested on pegs over the mantelpiece. A small stack of books sat on a crude shelf. A single tin plate and cup were washed and drying by a water basin. This was the home of a man who lived entirely within himself, who had long since made peace with silence. He was a stranger, and she was utterly at his mercy. Yet in the deliberate way he turned his back, in the simple offering of warmth and shelter without question, she felt a flicker of safety she hadn't known in a very long time. Her previous life had been one of conditional safety. She had worked for the Gables in the small, dusty settlement of Redemption, a town that rarely lived up to its name. She cooked and cleaned and made herself invisible, earning her keep until Mrs. Gable's petty jealousies and Mr. Gable's dwindling finances converged upon her. One morning, she was handed a few coins and told to be gone by noon. "A girl like you attracts trouble," Mrs. Gable had said, her face a mask of pious contempt, as if Alara's orphan status and quiet prettiness were moral failings she had cultivated herself. The accusation was the final push out the door and into the path of the oncoming storm. Now, wrapped in the man's dry blanket, the borrowed shirt hanging off her small frame, she huddled on the cot and watched his back as he methodically checked the seals on the window frames. He was preparing for a siege, and the blizzard was the enemy. He moved with a purpose that was comforting. He was a man who knew how to survive. For the first time in days, Alara felt she might survive, too. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights. The cabin became their entire world, a small bubble of warmth and light against the screaming void. They existed in a shared, nearly silent space. He would cook a pot of thin stew or coffee, handing her a portion without a word. She, in turn, would take their plates to the basin, washing them with a careful efficiency that did not go unnoticed. He slept in his bedroll by the fire, a bulwark between her and the door. He never spoke of her arrival, nor of her departure. He treated her presence like a fact of nature, as unavoidable and temporary as the blizzard itself. On the 3rd morning, the world outside was born anew, silent and buried under a thick blanket of pristine white. The wind had died, and the sun, when it rose, was blindingly bright against the snow. Alara expected to be sent on her way. She had been rehearsing her thanks, trying to find words that would convey her gratitude without sounding like a plea to stay. Silas pulled on his heavy coat and boots. He looked at her, his expression as neutral as the new snow. "Can you mend?" he asked. She nodded, surprised. "Yes." He pointed to a small wooden box in the corner. "Needles and thread are in there. My shirt's torn." He gestured to a flannel shirt hanging from a peg, a nasty rip in the sleeve. Then he picked up 2 buckets. "And the water won't fetch itself." He handed one to her. It wasn't a dismissal. It wasn't an invitation to stay. It was a task. It was a test. They worked. He cleared a path to the well and the barn, his shoulders straining against the heavy drifts. She, huddled by the fire, stitched his shirt with small, even seams, her fingers still stiff but her muscle memory sure. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots, he looked at the finished repair. He ran a calloused thumb over the neat stitches, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, in his eyes. He simply nodded. There's more to be done. That was it. That was her reprieve. A few unspoken words that meant she had earned another day, another meal. She felt a fragile shoot of hope push its way through the frozen soil of her despair. She was determined to prove she was not a burden. The next day, while he was out checking his trap lines, she found the courage to enter the barn. It was warmer than the outside, smelling of hay and horse. A big, rangy sorrel gelding watched her from its stall, its ears pricked with curiosity. The stall was in need of mucking out. It was heavy, dirty work, but it was honest work. She picked up the pitchfork and set to it. She was so absorbed in the task, in the simple rhythm of it, that she didn't hear him return. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" His voice was a whip crack in the quiet barn, making her jump and the horse sidle nervously. He strode over, his face thunderous, and took the pitchfork from her hands. "Get away from him. He could have kicked your head in. He's not used to strangers." Alara flinched from the anger in his voice, a familiar cowering instinct taking hold. But then, something else rose up to meet it, a spark of defiance. She had been meek and invisible for too long. "The work needed doing," she said, her own voice quiet but firm, not looking away from his glare. "I'm not afraid of it." He stared at her, the anger in his eyes slowly receding, replaced by that same assessing look. He saw not a foolish girl, but a woman with a spine, a woman who understood the relentless demands of a place like this. He had taken her in as a victim of the storm, a piece of flotsam. For the first time, he was seeing her as a person, and one with a surprising amount of grit. He let out a slow breath. "His name is Barrow," he said, his voice returning to its usual gruff monotone. "And you're right. The work needs doing. But next time, Let me do the introductions." That small confrontation shifted the ground between them. The silence that followed was different, less a void, and more a space for observation. Days melted into a week. They fell into a partnership dictated by the endless chores of the ranch. He taught her how to bank the fire so it would last through the night, how to read the sky for signs of more weather. She, in turn, showed him a way to patch his denims with a cross-stitch that was stronger and neater than his own crude repairs. She learned that he took his coffee black and bitter, and he learned that she had a quiet, humming tune she favored when she was kneading dough for their daily bread. One evening, the tune caught his ear. It was an old lullaby, one his mother used to sing. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, the question startling them both. It was the most personal thing he'd ever asked. Alara's hands stilled on the dough. The music died in her throat. "My mother," she whispered, her gaze falling to the flour-dusted table. A long time ago, the memory was a sudden, sharp pain. He saw the grief flash in her eyes, raw and unguarded. He didn't push. He just nodded and turned back to cleaning his rifle. But he had learned something new. She wasn't just a drifter. She was an orphan. Someone who had lost everything long before she'd collapsed at his door. Their tentative peace was shattered by the arrival of Jed, a trapper who passed through the valley once or twice a season. He was a weaselly man with eyes that darted everywhere, always calculating. When he saw Alara, his eyes lingered, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "Well now, Silas," Jed drawled, looking Alara up and down as if she were a horse for sale. "Didn't figure you for the type to find himself such pleasant company." Silas moved to stand slightly in front of Alara, his posture casual, but his presence a solid wall. "Jed," he said, his voice flat and cold. "State your business." Jed's questions became more pointed, his innuendos more slick. Silas's responses grew shorter, his jaw tightening until his hand came to rest on the handle of the wood axe leaning against the cabin wall. The message was clear. Jed, seeing he would get no purchase, finally took his leave, but not before giving Alara one last, suggestive wink. The intrusion of the outside world left a poison in the air. Alara withdrew into herself, the fear and uncertainty returning with a vengeance. She was reminded of her precarious position, a woman living under a man's roof with no official claim to be there. Jed's leering eyes were a reflection of how the world would see her, how Mrs. Gable saw her. She began trying to make herself smaller again, more useful, as if to offset the trouble her presence was causing. She even offered to sleep in the barn once more, an idea Silas dismissed with a glare so fierce it silenced her for the rest of the day. He felt it too. The anger at Jed wasn't just about the man's crudeness. It was a deeply personal, protective fury that unsettled him. He found himself watching her more, not just as a helper, but as Alara. He noticed the way a stray piece of her dark hair caught the firelight, the determined set of her jaw when she was wrestling with a stubborn task. His solitude had been his armor for so long, and he felt it cracking. When the snows had melted enough to make the track to Redemption passable, he knew they had to go. He needed supplies, and he wouldn't leave her alone. The thought of Jed or someone like him stopping by while he was gone was intolerable. The trip to town was a tense, silent affair. Alara kept her head down, her shawl pulled tight, but it wasn't enough. They saw her outside the general store. Mrs. Gable, flanked by two of her gossiping friends. Her eyes landed on Alara, then shifted to Silas standing beside her, and a look of malicious triumph crossed her face. She didn't speak to them. She didn't have to. She turned to her companions and made a comment, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the muddy street. "Amazing how quickly fallen women can find shelter with lonely bachelors. The devil finds work for idle hands, they say." The words struck Alara like a physical blow. The shame was a hot flush on her cheeks. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her. Silas's hand clamped down on her arm, not hard, but firm, steadying her. He stared at Mrs. Gable with an expression so cold and dangerous that the woman actually took a step back, her spiteful smile faltering. Without a word, he guided Alara into the store, his fury a palpable thing. The ride back to the ranch was thick with unspoken tension. The fragile peace of their isolated world had been definitively breached. The town's judgment followed them, a clinging, toxic fog. That night, Alara couldn't sit still. The cabin felt like a cage. Silas found her standing by the small window, staring out at the moonlit snow, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "They'll run you out of town on my account," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll bring nothing but trouble to you. I should leave. I can be gone by morning." He came to stand beside her, his large frame filling the space. The scent of pine and cold air clung to him. For a long time, he just looked out the window with her. "Let them try," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. He turned to face her, his gaze intense in the dim light. "This is my land. My house. You're not going anywhere." It wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a declaration. He had drawn a line in the snow, placing her firmly on his side of it. He had chosen. Her despair was a tangible thing in the small cabin, a weight that seemed to dim the lantern light. Seeing the way her shoulders bowed under the town's scorn, Silas felt an old, familiar anger coil in his gut. It was the same helpless rage he'd felt years ago. He made a decision then, one born not of passion, but of a fierce, protective justice. It was a practical solution to an ugly problem, and it was going to cost him the one thing he valued most, his solitude. "They did the same to my sister," he said, the words rough, as if pulled from a deep, unhealed wound. Alara looked up, startled. He had never spoken of a family, of a past. "Sarah, she was younger than you, engaged to be married. A man from town, a rival for her fiancé's business, started a rumor. Vicious lies. People like Mrs. Gable, they fed on it like crows on a carcass. Her fiancé, a weak man, believed them. He broke it off. The shame, it broke her." He stopped, his throat working. "She walked into the river that spring." He had never told another living soul that story. The secret was a hard, cold stone he'd carried for a decade. He was sharing its weight with her now, and Alara understood. This wasn't just about her. It was about Sarah. He was refusing to let history repeat itself on his land. "There are vultures in this world," he continued, his voice low and hard. "They circle and they wait, and they love nothing more than to pick the bones of someone they see as weak. There's only one way to shut their mouths for good." He paused, gathering himself. "We get married." Alara stared at him, speechless. "Marriage?" The idea was absurd, impossible. "But we barely know each other." "Knowing has nothing to do with it," he said bluntly. "This is about a piece of paper, a document that gives them nothing to whisper about. You'll be my wife, in name. You'll be safe here. You'll have a home, a real one. No one can touch you then. The work will be the same. Nothing else has to change." It was the most outlandish, and the most profoundly kind, proposition she had ever heard. He was offering her his name as a shield, offering to sacrifice his carefully guarded isolation to protect her from the cruelty of the world. She saw the pain for his lost sister still living in his eyes, and she realized his gruffness wasn't a lack of feeling, but a fortress built around a heart that had been broken long ago. He was a good man, a just man, hidden beneath a rough exterior. A strength she didn't know she possessed rose in her. He was offering her a partnership, and she would meet him as an equal. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady. "On one condition." He waited, his gaze unwavering. "That this is my home, not my prison," she stated. "That I am your partner in this, not your property." He considered her words, his expression serious. He saw the pride and resilience that had been there all along, the qualities he'd first glimpsed in the barn. He gave a single, decisive nod. Partner. The word hung between them, remaking their world. A week later, just as Silas had predicted, the vultures arrived. The town preacher, Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was exceeded only by his love for meddling, appeared on his horse with Mrs. Gable and another of her cronies riding alongside, a self-appointed committee on public morals. They dismounted and marched up to the porch, their faces pinched with righteous purpose. Silas met them at the door, stepping outside into the cold afternoon air. Alara came to stand beside him. She was terrified, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she held her head high. She would not cower. "Silas," the Reverend began, his tone oozing sanctimony. "We've come out of Christian concern. It is being said throughout the town that you are harboring this young woman, living together under one roof, outside the bonds of holy matrimony. It is a stain upon this community, a flouting of God's law." Mrs. Gable, unable to contain herself, chimed in. "He's right. What kind of example are you setting? Taking in a woman of her character, a known vagrant. They spoke as if Alara wasn't even there. Silas remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest, his face like granite. He let them empty their barrels of bile, let them expose the ugliness of their intentions. When they finally paused, breathless with their own virtue, Silas spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the yard with the weight of absolute authority. Reverend, Mrs. Gable, I'd be honored for you to meet my wife. He held up a piece of paper. It was a marriage certificate signed and stamped by the circuit judge in a neighboring county 2 days prior. The silence that followed was stunning. Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped. The Reverend blinked, his sermon dying on his lips. Wife? She finally sputtered, her face turning a blotchy red. You married her? The disdain in her voice was thick enough to curdle milk. It was the final, vicious jab. Alara felt a lifetime of being judged, of being deemed unworthy, welling up inside her. Just as she felt herself start to tremble, Silas's hand found hers. His fingers wrapped around her own, his grip warm, firm, and grounding. It was the first time he had ever touched her with such open, deliberate tenderness. It was an anchor in the storm of their judgment. And it gave her a voice. My husband, Alara said, the word feeling both strange and powerful on her tongue, offered me shelter when pious folks like you, Mrs. Gable, threw me out into a blizzard. He offered me respect when all you offered was scorn. This is my home, and you are not welcome in it. The force of her words, spoken with a quiet dignity that could not be challenged, struck the committee dumb. They had come expecting a shamed bachelor and a fallen woman. They found a husband and wife, united and resolute. Their hypocrisy was laid bare. Silas sacrificed his cherished solitude. Alara sacrificed her fear. And together, they claimed their own peace. Defeated, the Reverend mumbled a hasty, flustered goodbye. Mrs. Gable shot them a look of pure venom before turning on her heel. They mounted their horses and retreated back toward town, their crusade a humiliating failure. Silas and Alara were left standing on the porch, hand in hand, the vast silence of the valley rushing in to fill the space the intruders had occupied. The immediate threat was gone. He looked down at their joined hands, a strange look on his face, then met her eyes. You did good, he said. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. So did you, Silas, she replied softly. The story of their stand rippled through redemption. Some still whispered, but others began to look at the solitary rancher with a new kind of respect, and at his quiet wife with a grudging admiration. But none of that mattered in the quiet of the cabin. That evening, they sat before the fire, the document that bound them resting on the mantel. The cot was still in the corner, and his bedroll was still on the floor near the hearth. The physical distance between them remained, but the emotional chasm had closed. It was no longer a space of awkwardness, but one of quiet, comfortable possibility. Later, he rose to bank the fire for the night, the familiar, domestic ritual now imbued with a new significance. Alara watched him, the strong, silent man who had carried her in from the snow and shielded her with his own name. The blizzard that had nearly been her end had, instead, brought her home. She had offered to bed down in the barn, a place for an animal, a burden. He had insisted she take her place beside him, a place for a person, a partner. As he turned from the glowing embers, he met her gaze across the room. A flicker of something warm and unfamiliar moved in his expression. For the very first time, a small, genuine smile touched Silas's lips. In that quiet moment, Alara knew he hadn't just been talking about a place to sleep. He had been making a place for her in his life. And their story, the real one, was just beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.